the senior research and outreach associate at the Center for Economic Policy Research. Masuda Sultan, who is the co-founder of Unfreeze Afghanistan, a coalition formed in 2021 to advocate for the resumption of aid and protection of Afghanistan central bank assets. And last but not the least, our very own Ashley Subramanian Montgomery, who is a senior director of policy and advocacy at C&SN and who leads our financial access, sanctions, and human rights and counterterrorism portfolios. With that, let's begin our conversation. My first question is to George. George, in your book, The Sanctions Decade, you talk about the drastic change in national and UN sanctions and their sanctioning patterns post the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. Could you expand upon that change and the history of sanctions as we know them today? What did that experience teach you about the limits of economic pressure as a way of shaping political behavior, if you even think that there are limits to this?
Well, thank you very much, Purika and Ashley, for sponsoring this session, and delighted to be with Michael and Masuda on this panel. It's a tough question. We're now looking at 35 years worth of sanctions development. I'd like to reflect a little bit on them in terms of decade form, if I might, in my allotted 10 minutes. The sanctions decade of 1990 to 2000 was so intriguing because it, of course, coincided with the end of the Cold War. And so a newly infused degree of cooperation in the UN Security Council corresponded with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and an appeal to Chapter 7 of the UN to take action because of territorial aggression. And they did so in a massive way, learning as they went to assess what it meant and to continue to impose and evaluate comprehensive trade sanctions, having the issue being a country whose 97% of income came from the export of oil. And so these trade sanctions became the norm for the decade. The UN, in establishing the framework, really focused on four issues that it considered threats to peace and security: territorial aggression and violent conflict being one, the abuse of human rights and disturbance of elected governments as a second, nuclear and weapons of mass destruction proliferation as a third, and later by the end of the decade, countering terrorism and terrorist violations. That fourfold approach led to 11 sanctions in one decade, most of them focused on ending conventional war within sub-Saharan African nations. And so you had some real good fortune with a number of wars in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Angola ending as a result, partly of the sanctions contribution, but also the overall effort of a cooperative Security Council to accompany sanctions with peacekeeping efforts and heightened diplomacy and mediation to try to pull together these three or four strengths of the UN in a way to end those conflicts. Comes the end of that first decade, and there's also a critical reflection on the devastating sanctions on Iraq and a call for humanitarian recognition of what's going on to the people of Iraq. And you had the development during the decade first of the Oil for Food program, but it threw open a whole list of concerns about what sanctions were doing. And the UN system and cooperative nations on the Security Council responded with a series of conferences that generated what was later called targeted or smart sanctions. These sanctions were policy measures taken again at the start of the council as the generating body that focused on financial dynamics and constraining asset freezes, banks, the movement of monies to and fro different locales, and it augmented, in a sense, or replaced, was meant to replace comprehensive sanctions, because comprehensive sanctions could give way to commodity sanctions and other kinds of trade restrictions without being fully covering the entire economy. They were accompanied by other restrictions, arms embargoes, travel sanctions, and the theory of the case was that you'd lessen the effect on innocent populations, be able to more significantly target on the leaders responsible for the terrible policies, almost to the point of sort of matching the sanctions imposed to the particular offense generated against international law or international norms. So leaders overthrew a duly elected government and started to repress their citizens. What you did is you went after both the country's sovereign wealth funds run by the leaders, but also the individual accounts that the leaders had in Zurich banks and elsewhere. As the decade of the 2000s develop, we find that a lot of other troubles come into the fray here. Certainly, the rejection of sanctions itself by the United States to begin the Iraq War, even though the sanctions worked in controlling nuclear proliferation against Iraq. So, too, do we find an increasing awareness that some other changes have happened in the system that are affecting the use of sanctions. The first is the assumption we had by the mid 2000s and later into the decade that these would be used discreetly on various aspects of bad behavior of a country to bring it to the bargaining table. I think it's fair to say that many decision makers going more to the pressure that their own sanctions, these UCMs, could generate, decided they were in a wonderful smorgasbord. Let's take a lot of each of these discrete targeted sanctions, put them together, and impose those on the bad leadership because maybe the greater added pressure would bring greater results. The problem was multifold. The first was that a number of these regimes facing sanctions just plain dug in because they had already experienced the terrible hit initially, and they rallied around the population that supported them, repressed the populations that didn't, that were feeling the worst of the sanctions, and passed along some of the other worst of the sanctions to those folks. The economic globalization that was occurring meant that the movement of money was so much more dynamic than it was in the year 2000 that these particularly banking sanctions and asset freezes were really, really punching populations as a whole instead of just the leadership. And assessing the dynamic there and being able to modify it was particularly difficult. So, too, the dynamic of how you transport humanitarian aid into countries, if you were able to organize relief from sanctions, that became complicated by the targeted financial sanctions and the commodity sanctions you had put in place because it restricted certain shipping, focused on insurance groups and other groups that supported this. So, in a sense, the sanctions dynamic, especially in its multifaceted, multi-targeted dynamic, took on a life of a stricture of its own. But it's also important to note, I think, that the rift in the Security Council that develops after the Iraq War and really comes to a head in 2011 with the Libyan and the Syrian situation. There was a philosophical, I guess, to put it in its best light, disagreement between the Western states on the Council and Russia and China on the other. Russia and China believed that a Security Council resolution on sanctions constituted the global ceiling of what you were going to impose on the bad doers. And at the same time, recognizing the responsibility of member states to implement and enforce sanctions might have included some direct action by your government to enforce those. They read the Western states taking off on enforcement and implementation as way over the top. I think it's often said that the Western states saw sanctions at the Security Council not as a ceiling, but as a springboard to go after particularly not just the government you were focused in or the bad guys, but also those sanctions evaders and those that were helping the government so that targets evade sanctions. So the explosion in the number of sanctions is a general philosophical and practical difference that gives rise to and empowers more of these what would be called the UCMs. Also in this decade of the upper 2000s and 2011 and after, you see that the supportive mechanisms have become so much more sophisticated at the financial level in the capitalist, let's say the Western states, that the permutation into an economy that's been sanctioned can be diverted by the leaders much more to other sectors that are in the leaders' favor. Meanwhile, yeah, we have to recognize that powerful states like the United States and then the collection of European states also continued some of their non-UN Security Council sanctions. U.S. case, the most dramatic being Cuba, but updated more recently, Iran, North Korea, Nicaragua, and now Venezuela. And so the idea that sanctions should be based just in the Security Council, was a dilemma that the West decided to go its own way on some of these. It's also important that some of the basic rules that made sanctions work in the first decade, dramatically accompanied by diplomacy, accompanied by other structures and features of the architecture of peace building and negotiation, those had fallen apart after a decade and a half of sanctions. And then finally, of course, the heritage of 9/11 and the burst in counterterrorism sanctions meant that you weren't sanctioning just a few isolated leaders of a state or the state. You were going much more after individuals and entities, and the specially designated list explodes, not only at the UN, but in a number of countries. I'd like to close with a degree of optimism, though, because there has been since 2019 and 20 a dramatic recognition, partly fueled by wonderful organizations like your own, the NGO community, the international humanitarian community, saying, wait a minute, that the revolution of targeted smart sanctions didn't do it for us. Now what's the next deal? What can we do to certainly change the dynamic? I was struck in 2024 in looking at Concern Worldwide and the International Crisis Group, and each of them look at the places where there are major humanitarian disasters and where ongoing wars exist. And in every one of those 18 states that they looked at, sanctions had become almost a permanent feature of the last 2 decades of what was happening there. So the intertwining of disaster and sanctions, while sanctions may not have generated the disaster, it's been so interwoven, we're starting to peel back that. UN Security Council Resolution 2664 in December of 22 began that process at the behest and pushing of Ireland in the United States. We've had other recent processes where some of you on this audience have been part of, in particular the Wilton Park process, and more recently the emergence of the Bologna process of sanctions relief, where I think the humanitarian community, the civil society groups, and those concerned about UCMs have marching orders to go forward. And I'll just stop there and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, George. I really appreciate that very comprehensive explanation of how sanctions have proliferated since the 1990s. I think the idea of going from targeting rentier states for their main, point of pain to clubbing these smart sanctions to become broad-based, which is antithetical to the actual purpose of these smart sanctions, is a cause for real concern even today. And so picking up off of that, this sets Ashley up, I think, perfectly. Ashley, from your perspective, how would you describe the current sanctions landscape? Who, if anyone, is actually positioned to monitor the impacts of these now broad-based measures? And where do you see the biggest gaps in oversight or accountability today?
Thank you so much, Purvika, and echoing Purvika's thanks and all of you joining us today during this busy time of the year. It's always a daunting task to follow George, who's been a real stalwart leader and pillar of the sanctions space over so many years. So the current sanctions landscape is, I would say, as ever complex. But I do echo George in thinking that there is room for hope. So I'm going to walk us through a few of the current trends throughout the sanctions landscape, and then come to your point, Purvika, about accountability and monitoring and oversight. So I would say the first trend, and picking up on where George left off in the current landscape, is on humanitarian exemptions and humanitarian carve-outs. And this is one aspect where we do see real room for hope and where a lot of progress has been made. So picking up on the points about humanitarian exemptions really becoming more prevalent and more integrated into sanctions imposition and sanctions regimes than we've seen in the past. As George noted, December 2022, the passing of UN Security Council Resolution 2664 created the standing humanitarian carve-out across all existing and new UN asset freeze measures. One real significant part of this resolution was that it also applied to the UN's 1267 regime, which is essentially the UN's counterterrorism regime, though it only applied to this for an initial 2-year period. But I really want to note that it took a decade of advocacy, research, pushes for policy and political reform and change from largely civil society actors and others to be able to bring this resolution to fruition. So advocates were told when this idea was first introduced that this was impossible, it would never happen, but it didn't stop them from persisting until the impossible finally became possible. And this is also where we see room for hope, and hopefully can encourage whatever your pushes are, keep going, even if it takes time. So then after this, within a few days of this resolution being passed, the US then implemented Resolution 2664 within their domestic sanctions context in adopting and issuing new and amended baseline general licenses across many, though notably not all, of US sanctions regimes. Another positive point here is that civil society, including Charity and Security Network and others, gave very detailed and concrete input to the Treasury Department on the development of these new and amended baseline general licenses. And we did this in a really broad coalition that had a lot of different equities and actors involved. And much of this input was adopted into the new and amended baseline general licenses. So another point of hope. And then finally, in December 2024, the UN adopted Resolution 2761, which created a standing application or indefinite humanitarian carve-out of the 1267 regime, which, as I noted, had initially only been adopted for that 2-year period. And this was really, really significant because the 1267 regime is really the most consequential part of Resolution 2664, because over 100 million people who require aid live in contexts where 1267 designated entities operate. And I really, we know that sanctions are a foreign policy tool and they're highly technical, but I really want us to take note of the significance of 100 million people being able to continue receiving aid because of this new resolution, and not lose sight of the fact that ultimately, yes, sanctions are technical, they're political, they're policy, they're law, but any law and policy is really only good as the impact it has on people's lives and homes and communities and ability to live. So this resolution is a really big example of how humanitarian exemptions under sanctions regimes can have impact across a really wide swath of lives. So the second trend I want to pick up on is on sanctions complexity, sometimes coordination, but more often lack thereof, and policy incoherence across other types of measures. So as folks probably are aware, there's growing complexity across sanctions regimes imposed by different governments and sanctioned entities. Obviously, the UN Security Council resolutions I noted try to bring some harmonization across those, but there's still a lot of incoherence across, thank you, Parvika, across these different entities. And the levels of coordination we sometimes saw under the Biden administration have pretty much been dismantled under the Trump administration and are now non-existent. And a lot of countries are leaning on their autonomous sanctions regimes versus consensus-based sanctions regimes like we see at the UN level. A good example of this is Syria. When General License 23 for the earthquake was issued by the US, they only extended this for 6 months and then they wouldn't extend it further. But the UK, the EU, and Switzerland all extended it further. This leaves banks and the financial sector in a position where they now have to navigate across compliance complexity and multiple different sanctions regimes. And this leads to the third trend about de-risking and over-compliance. So largely due to when we see incoherence across sanctions regimes, though again, these resolutions have helped with that, financial institutions, then their approach to sanctions enforcement and internal policy still often goes far beyond what's legally required. And this leads to trends like the continued de-risking of nonprofits and civil society organizations. And this is particularly prevalent in jurisdictions that are deemed high risk. And what this leads to is limits in financial access and inclusion, sadly, often in areas where humanitarian aid is most needed. The final part to say on this is that there's also a lack of harmonization across sanctions law, counterterrorism measures, and AML-CFT regulations. So this creates further policy incoherence and then leads to further de-risking and over-compliance. The fourth trend that actually I'm going to skip this one because I think Michael will probably touch on this in his future and just noting time. So I'm going to move actually to the fifth trend we see on sanctions is around gender. I would say there's finally more awareness, though by no means has enough research been done or enough awareness been raised, but there's finally more awareness coming out that sanctions have deeply gendered impacts. They've always had deeply gendered impacts, and this is particularly prevalent for women-led organizations, gender justice groups, peace-building groups, gender minorities, LGBTQIA communities. But these impacts have largely been overlooked, and sanctions development and imposition still sadly rarely takes these factors into account. But at least there's some levels of research and conversations around this now coming out. Quick examples: in North Korea, we see that sanctions lead women into economically compromised positions and situations where they're at heightened risk of sexual exploitation and abuse. Masuda will take us through Afghanistan in much more detail. But in that context, we see sanctions forcing families into impossible choices where they will sometimes sell one child so that they have enough access and resources to then feed and support the rest of the family. So really dire gendered consequences. The sixth trend we see that just in the Syria context, there's almost a wholesale removal of sanctions. That's not something we see all of that often. So with that shining a new spotlight in hopefully positive ways on how do we do sanctions termination well, and how do we do re-engagement and reconstruction well in a country that was previously one of the most heavily sanctioned contexts in the world. Seventh trend, just a growing acknowledgement that sanctions haven't worked in Russia. So something to be following and keeping an eye on for all those who kind of think sanctions work all the time, no matter what. And then the final trend is also a growing acknowledgement, I would say, around hypocrisy around how sanctions are imposed and implemented. So very quickly, because I know I'm over time, but in the occupied West Bank, the sanctions on Israeli settlers really raised the issue in ways we haven't often seen about how do we make sanctions more humane. So for all of us who want sanctions to always be human rights compliant, to always uphold obligations under international law, this is an entry point, but at the same time, I think a source of great frustration and hypocrisy because we really only see this conversation unfold because the sanctions are on Israeli actors. Last part of this hypocrisy, just I think a growing acknowledgement that sanctions are really a tool that can only be wielded by powerful actors. So, for instance, the US can and has imposed sanctions on, let's say, a country like Somalia, but there's no real way that Somalia could impose sanctions back on the US in any kind of way that would have the same harms or impact. So who gets to sanction and who has sanctions imposed upon them, I think is a growing acknowledgement. Okay, so finally, just to wrap up quickly, the points about monitoring impacts and accountability. There's sadly not a lot of oversight and accountability measures, especially for autonomous sanctions. We do see monitoring committees for UN sanctions, so there's more oversight measures there, but domestic ones, there's hardly any. It's sadly a lot of times just governments imposing sanctions without oversight being built into how sanctions are imposed or even being added in at a later stage. It's only recently that the Treasury Department's even been said that sanctions should be tied to a foreign policy goal every time. So in the past, we saw sometimes sanctions imposed without real aims or objectives. And when they do have foreign policy aims, they're often dubious. So kind of back to Cuba, there was a declassified document that essentially said that sanctions were meant to harm the Cuban people to such a large degree that they would rise up and overthrow the Castro regime. So even when there are goals attached, we need to ask ourselves, should these goals be legally allowed? Are they just? Should we be asking this of any people of any country? And I would say no. Two main ways, and then I promise I'm done, that we could build more accountability and oversight and monitoring. Very simple. I think statutes, it maybe not simple to do, but they could be done if there was political will. So simple in that way. Statutes and sanctions law just mandating impact assessments so that we could measure, are sanctions working? And if not, can we think about terminating them or building off ramps? And then second, building in sunset provisions from the onset of sanctions being imposed so that they can't go on into perpetuity. So long way to go, but still a lot of room for hope. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Porvika. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I feel like you really stood up to the daunting task of covering all of this in 10 minutes. So thank you for doing that. And on that subject of the lack of accountability and this, intrinsic social cost of sanctions because of rampant de-risking, because of the gendered impacts, I'd like to turn to you, Masuda. Uh, a lot of us sit here in DC or in New York, and we have this theoretical understanding of sanctions, but you've actually worked in this environment. And it can be hard for a lot of people to imagine what the day-to-day humanitarian, human rights, or peace building work looks like when you're trying to move people, supplies, and funds under a sanction regime when the entire ecosystem is more cautious. Could you perhaps start by describing what operating in that context in Afghanistan actually looked like for you, and then share what you tend to encounter as the most significant practical hurdles?
Sure, absolutely. And I do want to say a huge thank you from the bottom of my heart to the Charity and Security Network, because I was very frustrated when we were operating in Afghanistan and trying to get answers to questions that nobody seemed to be able to answer. And that's how I found Charity and Security Network. And it was the only place that was doing this kind of work in such a coordinated way, coalition way with so many different organizations. So I truly appreciate the work that you're doing. I'll just tell you a story because you are all experts, but I'll just tell you a story of my experience with Afghanistan. I've been working in Afghanistan for over 20 years, close to 25 years. And we built a women's organization over the course of the 20 years of the U.S. involvement, which became the largest women's organization. And we ran a network of shelters for domestic violence survivors, women in prison. Most of them have been in prison for moral crimes. And by the time that the Taliban US negotiations were happening, we were very concerned about the Taliban returning to power and what that would mean for our women and our organization and the work that we were doing. And so we began to try to figure out if we could speak to the Taliban in some of those conferences that were happening that the US was helping to organize. And we did make an inroad despite being shut out of that process. We kind of crashed some of those events and found our way to talking to the Taliban, although we were afraid that because of these sanctions, we might actually, and there was a big debate within the organization, whether we would be punished for trying to do so. But we thought it was the only way to save our women from potential harm. Once the U.S. had left, we had no protection. And so we needed to sort of get ahead of that. Fast forward, and we did talk to the Taliban, and we sort of started making some inroads. But then there was this fear around, like, what if we are seen as cooperating with them because they are sanctioned and they're on the specially designated terrorist group list by the U.S. since 2001, 2002. So it created a whole lot of difficulty and conflict within the organization. A lot of people were afraid to talk about it. We tried contacting lawyers and experts, and all the experts that were sort of like dealing with Afghanistan said, of course, you have to talk to the Taliban. This will lower the risk of your women getting killed, of a center getting attacked. And we felt it was our obligation to do something rather than just sit there like sitting ducks. But as the violence increased around the country, especially as the U.S. started pulling out, the provinces started falling. We were in a very precarious situation because we had not fully revealed to the Taliban what our organization was doing, and there was still a conflict within the organization. But when Kabul fell, we in an emergency trip to Doha went to meet the Taliban to say, "Hey, listen, we are the co-founders. Me and my co-founder went of this organization since 2001. This is the work that we're doing." And their initial reaction was, "Oh, you're breaking up families. This is terrible work." And then we started to explain to them the types of women that we were dealing with. For example, a young woman whose father had plucked out every single one of her eyebrows and was threatening to kill her, that we had brought into one of our shelters. And the family guidance work that we were doing, bringing families together when there was a problem in a community, bringing her family, bringing the abuser, bringing her to discussions, which was the majority of our work, was actually family guidance centers. And by the end of those discussions, when we told them some of the stories, they actually said, "You're doing good work." They ended up giving us protection at our offices. Now, I'm not saying it was perfect, but it was the beginning of a conversation. Now, while this was happening in Afghanistan, our main shelter had congregated into one shelter in Kabul, and in a panicked moment, the executive director had closed down the shelter, and the women, thinking the Taliban would attack us, and we would reconvene later. The women had been out on the streets, and there was complete chaos in Kabul. So they were literally roaming the parks with nothing to eat, a little bit of money that had been given to them, but in need of blankets and food and shelter. And the hardest part of this was getting a call from a friend, a journalist who had heard that these women were roaming the streets and needed help, and trying to track them down and then trying to send them money. So the second part of this problem was that because everything was in collapse and the sanctions were there, we didn't have a way, with the banking system situation first it was like shut down, but then later people were afraid to send money. Like days later when we actually could send money, we were afraid to send money because we would be seen as potentially supporting the Taliban. So this was the next kind of debate within our women's organization, is were we allowed to send them money? And I mean, I just couldn't believe the level of fear that people had. And it was exactly because of the way that the Taliban have been designated legally, from talking to them, from sending money to our own women, and here we are. The irony of it is we're an organization created to protect women, but we couldn't even protect our own women. And actually, we had a lot of money pouring in the US to help them. And to the credit of the US, there was general licenses issued. And even when the general licenses were issued, people were still trying to navigate whether this was, what was okay, how was it okay? And this was much, much later. So our women, some of them had to get married to people they met on the streets. I mean, it was just like or to relatives. Some of them went back to family members. It was just the most horrifying way to kind of end the 20 years of the promises that were made to these women and to Afghans in general. I want to say that as we started to kind of explore these banking issues and how do we send money and all of the fear around all of this, I discovered this issue of the asset freezes was affecting the banking sector, because we were trying to get down to the bottom line of what was going on with banking. And the banks were essentially cut at the knees, and talking to companies that couldn't send, the normal supplies that they usually do through the banking system. Even when general license was issued, they were having problem because of banks overcompliance. So the banks were telling them there's sanctions on Afghanistan, and they were saying, well, no, there's not sanctions, it's a general license. And we went to the State Department and said to the special representative, Tom West, and said, hey, listen, I do work with the private sector as well, the chambers of commerce. And he said, well, there's a general license. You can show the bank the general license. Here's the website. And everyone's going, the bank doesn't care. You can show them as many websites of the US Treasury as you want. They literally don't care. So for like 2 years, we were running around saying, what do we do about this? What do we do about this? And we couldn't find a solution. And it dawned on all of us that because people were saying, it's not the sanctions. It's just overcompliance by the banks. And okay, you can make the argument that it's technically not the sanctions because the general license is there. But how do you how do you force a bank to do business with someone? They don't want to do business with someone that's going to be potentially risky down the road for various legal reasons and political reputational reasons. So it is actually the chilling effects of the sanctions that have then created this. And sort of just to kind of summarize the next terrible things that happened was besides like the aid being frozen, teachers not getting paid, and as women's rights activists, we had to work to try to get the teachers paid because they're the largest sector of female employment that the country had. Now, the NGO workers, weren't able to get their salaries. Now that has eased a little bit, but what has happened still, I mean, the women have pressure on the one hand from the Taliban, restricting their ability to work, and all of this to say, we know the Taliban are terrible. We want something to be done about them. But just like the 20 years of war, we didn't want innocent people to be killed. We didn't want huge bombs to be dropped on innocent families and children. By the same token, we need to look at how these tools are affecting innocent people. And we also don't want the entirety of the Afghan population to suffer through extreme poverty, and now to be aid dependent because their economy can't get on its feet because of the restrictions, the perceptions of these restrictions, and the ongoing isolation of Afghanistan as a result of these sanctions. Do we want the Taliban behavior to change? Absolutely. Of course, we want the Taliban behavior to change. We've been wanting that for a very long time. That's the work that we do. But they seem to still be in power. They seem to be stronger as ever. They have their palaces. They have their multiple homes, their multiple wives. They're not suffering. They're not the ones that are suffering through this. But Afghans are the ones going through extreme poverty. 24 million people, that are on the brink of, emergency, poverty levels of close to famine. This is what we have every year. Then the UN steps in and begs for money, and that cycle is starting to fade. So it's just really unfair to a country that we said we were going to help build into a modern economy, help them with their banking system, and then to turn around and say, all of you can go to hell, overthrow the Taliban. Well, the US wasn't able to overthrow the Taliban. NATO wasn't able to overthrow the Taliban. So how do we expect a population of poor, starving people to suddenly be able to overthrow the Taliban when we've shut all the other doors on them? It makes no sense to do this to the people of Afghanistan. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Masuda, because that was, I think, a really powerful intervention that grounds a lot of the theory that we've been talking about so far. And specifically the piece that you touched upon in the end, which is the collective punishment aspect of sanctions, right? You're talking about, as you said, a poor, starving population overthrowing the Taliban. When the NATO wasn't able to do it, it is ultimately collective punishment where you're hoping the suffering becomes unbearable enough that people take up arms against the government, which is specifically painful. And I think that touches really well upon the human cost of sanctions, right? Which I believe, Michael, your research with CPER and your own Sanctions Watch newsletter really touches upon that human cost piece of sanctions very well and very regularly. The most striking finding across all of CPER's findings for me is the present present human cost of these sanctions when compared to war, right? Because the most recent report that CPER put out talked about how sanctions were deadlier than war. Could you explain this piece and your overall research a little bit more? And additionally, we're now seeing a new generation of these sanctions, those aimed at the ICC, those tied to irregular migration controls in the UK. The secondary sanctions flow from designations of cartels or even, European groups called Antifa. What do you think this means for the future of sanctions, especially when we talk about the associated human cost?
Yeah, thank you. Apologies, I tend to speak quickly, but we have a lot to cover. And thanks especially for organizing this. I think the International Day Against Unilateral Coercive Measures is incredibly important to recognize. It was established in June by a vote in the UN General Assembly of 116 to 51. So there is this global recognition of the need to push back on the unilateral coercive measures, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us to use this day as an occasion to push for the same. So as you mentioned, we at CPER have been studying the humanitarian impacts of sanctions, unilateral coercive measures for some time now. As you said, they're often presented as this humane alternative to war. And what I'd like to share here is that it's not. As you say, the effects are often comparable to war. Now, the fact that sanctions impede humanitarian activity, as others here have mentioned, is incredibly important, and humanitarian exemptions are very welcome and necessary. But I want to share that the human impacts of sanctions go far beyond limits to humanitarian activity. The broadest sanctions can have truly massive macro level effects on entire economies that in turn affect every civilian in targeted economies. Now, broad-based sanctions can impede economic growth. They can trigger or extend recessions and depressions. They restrict access to critical resources like medicine, food, and energy. And in doing so, they exacerbate rates of poverty, illness, and hunger. All of these cause immense human suffering and can also include significant numbers of deaths. Now, a few bits of research, literature, largely from CEPR, to run by you. So in 2023, CEPR Senior Research Fellow Francisco Rodriguez conducted a literature review of all of the peer-reviewed econometric studies on the impacts of sanctions on civilians. 94% of these studies found that broad economic sanctions adversely impact measures of human well-being, including income, poverty, mortality, and human rights. That final 6% just had inconclusive results. One study associated sanctions on average with a decline in per capita GDP of 26%, which is roughly equivalent to the magnitude of the Great Depression. Others found that sanctions cause, on average, a 1.4-year decrease in women's life expectancy. It was mentioned that women are disproportionately impacted by sanctions. That is comparable to the global decline in life expectancy of COVID-19. Now, another study found a 2.5% increase in rates of HIV infection among children. So this is just to show this range of impacts of economic sanctions. This year, Rodriguez and CEPR co-director Mark Weisbrot and economist Silvio Rendon, as you mentioned, published this landmark study in the prestigious peer-reviewed journal Lancet Global Health. And using 4 different econometric methods, and a data set of age-specific mortality rates and sanctions events for 152 countries in a time frame of over 50 years, they found that unilateral economic sanctions cause, on average, over 500,000 excess deaths around the world each year, which is more than the annual number of battle-related casualties. I want to emphasize that again, over 500,000 deaths. Again, this is 4 different statistical methods corroborate this in a peer-reviewed journal. There's no reason to doubt that figure, but even if we did, even if it was overestimating by a magnitude of 4, by 4 times, if the real number were a quarter of that, it would be an egregious atrocity occurring every single year, and a preventable one. Now, to delve more into our research on a particular case, we have that of Venezuela, which is unfortunately all too timely these days. We know that Venezuela's economic crisis began before the imposition of major economic sanctions in 2017 and 2019. And that fact is often wielded to claim that sanctions are not a major factor in the crisis, but that's incorrect. Sanctions clearly, empirically deepened and lengthened Venezuela's economic crisis. Rodriguez, again, estimates that about half of the economic contraction was as a result of economic sanctions and other isolation measures. This contraction itself was 3 times the magnitude of the Great Depression and the largest peacetime economic contraction in modern history. Now, years ago, Mark Weisbrot again and the economist Jeff Sachs estimated that sanctions contributed to 40,000 excess deaths in Venezuela in 1 year alone. Now, I threw a lot of numbers out there, but just want to sit with that unfathomable amount of pain and suffering that result from the wielding of these unilateral coercive measures. A quick tangent to mention as well the migratory impacts. I think very few of us here are opposed to migration per se, quite the opposite. But we should all be able to agree that the US should not be creating the conditions that force people to leave their homes if they don't want to. And that's exactly what sanctions do. An October 2024 study found that US-EU sanctions increase emigration from target countries by 22 to 24% on average. And looking again at Venezuela, Rodriguez estimates that 4.1 million of the 7 million Venezuelans that fled during the economic crisis did so as a result of the impacts of sanctions. You can also look at Cuba, which has been stifled by the US embargo, referred to many as a blockade for its extraterritorial effects. They've been stifled by that for a very long time, but especially in recent years, as a result of Trump-Biden policies, they've been facing a particularly acute crisis. So much so that 10% of the island's population left in 2022 and 2023 alone. So this is not only are sanctions immiserating civilians, they are doing so to such an extent that can make it unbearable to remain in their home countries and exacerbates the migratory situation. Now, what I'd like to point out as well is that these human impacts of economic sanctions are not incidental. I don't want to sound, it can sound conspiratorial at first glance, but it's quite evident that this is actually the logic of sanctions. The broad harms are often a deliberate part of the strategy and mechanism in many cases. And you don't have to take my word for that. Congressman Jim McGovern, who at the time was chair of the Lantos Human Rights Committee, writes, and I quote, "The impact of sectoral and secondary sanctions is indiscriminate and purposefully so. Although U.S. officials regularly say that sanctions target the government and not the people, the whole point of maximum pressure camp is to increase the economic cost to Venezuela. Economic pain is the means by which sanctions are supposed to work. It is not Venezuelan officials who suffer the costs. It is the Venezuelan people." End quote. Now, that's often sort of a hidden agenda of sanctions, but under the Trump's first administration, this was often said out loud. You know, the veil was lifted. Pompeo, for example, said regarding Iran, quote, "Things are much worse for the Iranian people, and we're convinced that will lead the Iranian people to rise up and change the behavior of the regime." That was in response to a question about whether or not sanctions were working. And that's Trump, of course, but officials from both parties regularly measure the success of sanctions by these macro level measures, such as, you know, oil sales, exports, GDP, these measures that undoubtedly affect the entire people of targeted economies. And this goes back a very long time. I'll stop these quotes soon, but a declassified 1960 State Department memo from the beginning of regarding the Cuba embargo suggested, quote, "denying money and supplies to Cuba to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government." So there are many more quotes that I can point to here, but the point is that these broad, devastating human impacts of sanctions are, in many cases, not a mistake, but the intent themselves. So that's a long-winded answer to your first question. Now, I want to say, you know, these impacts, this has been the norm of US policy for a very long time now, as we've heard from George. But I'd like to speak as well to a few recent developments that I think are also problematic, none of which, though, imply that the status quo ante was anything less than egregious. These are just new developments that are worth keeping an eye on. So there are a few ways that sanctions has evolved as of late. As you mentioned, the UK has recently announced a raft of sanctions targeting individuals and organizations that it alleges are involved in abetting illegal migration. So that includes criminal networks that produce fake documents, but even a Chinese boat manufacturer, because these boats are used to smuggle migrants. Now, it seems highly unlikely to me that this is going to address the real causes of migration. And ironically, as we just mentioned, sanctions are actually one of these causes. But it seems to be that labor is trying to look like it's doing something, being tough, regardless of the actual consequences. And this is a clear broadening of the typical ambit of sanctions. Now, Trump, of course, has famously used sanctions to punish officials of the International Criminal Court for daring to investigate the US and Israel. The US is no stranger to running roughshod over international law, particularly when it comes to the ICC, but this is also an escalation of overt attacks on the court. And also, as you mentioned, Purvika, Trump has designated Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization and designated a number of European organizations allegedly linked to Antifa as foreign terrorist organizations and specially designated terrorist groups. Now, in these cases, sanctions are not geographically confined or limited to well-defined organizations. They're nebulous tools being used for judicial politics, migration management, and domestic security debates. And the more nebulous the tool, the harder it will be for other actors like migrant justice groups, migrant humanitarian groups, to determine the legality of their actions. And this has really serious effects on overcompliance, the types of issues that Masuda mentioned. And the broader and more ambiguous the category, the more likely that institutions, financial institutions, humanitarian groups will have to overcomply. But perhaps the broadest recent development in the sanctions sphere doesn't really pertain to what are traditionally considered sanctions at all, but are the second Trump administration's use of tariffs as what amount to unilateral coercive measures. Tariffs not as a tool of industrial policy, as they're typically intended, but in order to pressure foreign governments to bend to US demands, whether surrounding trade or migration or their own internal legal affairs. As, for example, in Brazil, Trump raised tariffs on Brazil and simultaneously imposed some sanctions on a jurist in response to prosecuting former President Bolsonaro for having incited a coup. That's quite a case of not only a violation of sovereignty, but the extension of tariffs to where they had never been used before. It's really quite unprecedented. And in fact, many of these tariffs have been imposed by invoking the same international emergency economic power authorities that are used to impose most US sanctions. So this boundary between what is a tariff and what is a sanction has been massively blurred recently. All the more so with these so-called secondary tariffs, tariffs on other countries that are primarily punishment for violating sanctions or taking actions that the US does not want it to take. For example, secondary tariffs that have been imposed on India in punishment for buying Russian oil. So what are the implications here? Now, in some cases, Trump's use of tariffs as sanctions have been effective in the short term from Trump's perspective in gaining some concessions. Now, there was this famous Twitter back and forth between Trump and Colombian President Petro after Petro refused to allow 2 US military aircraft to land carrying deported Colombians. In that Twitter exchange, Trump openly threatened tariffs, and Petro ultimately backed down. He found a few ways to save face a little bit, but was forced to back down. So that's an example of, from Trump's perspective, this brute force working. But I think in the long term, I think Trump's indiscriminate weaponization of global trade, once this hallowed principle of neoliberalism, has ruffled feathers even among those who were willing to go along with more traditional unilateral sanctions when they were being weaponized primarily against poorer countries in the global south. There's evidence, for example, of European policymakers and businesses turning more so to China to diversify their trade, diversify their supply chains, especially with China, but also other sort of emerging economies, as a response to the new risks associated with US tariffs, these unpredictable weaponized US tariffs. So seeing that trend, hopefully, and I can't predict the future, but hopefully these developments in the world of unilateral coercive measures are being met with the strengthening of alternative relations and institutions that can help to mitigate the ability of any one actor in the global economy, namely the US, to so easily weaponize the mechanisms of global trade and finance. That would be my long-term prediction, but that's the long term. And as this process unfolds, it remains a big question of just how many will continue to have to suffer under unilateral coercive measures in the meantime.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you again for sticking to time when you had so much to cover. And you did a fantastic and very comprehensive job in doing that. I do want to make one note, though, because I feel like Katie, who is our senior legal advisor, would appreciate me doing this. FTOs are not sanctions. It's more the secondary sanctions risk from interacting with a foreign terrorist organization. That's what broadens the scope of these initial designations. So just want to clarify the legal distinction between these two things. And again, this is not legal advice, but yes. Thank you so much, Michael. That was incredibly comprehensive. And the examples, I think, especially from Venezuela, really ground the human cost of these sanctions, especially because Venezuela is usually given as an example of, smart or targeted sanctions. But in a country where oil is the main, source of income and is a large part of the GDP, how targeted are sanctions on oil, right? So thank you so much for that overview and for also your overview of the future of sanctions and the rise of thematic sanctions as we see them today, because they are truly concerning, not more egregious than what we've seen before, but I think an extension of just that same egregious pattern, as you noted. So thank you for that overview, and thank you to all of our speakers for their interventions. And we can now open the floor to questions from our audience. I do want to note that usually we don't have time for audience questions because the events run over, but our speakers have been great at keeping to time, and we also have a more intimate audience this time around. So, welcoming any questions from anybody in the audience if there are any at this time. While you come up with these questions, I have a question that I would like to ask. Um, Actually, to Masuda specifically, when we talk about sanctions in Afghanistan and attitudes of people living in Afghanistan versus the diaspora, have you seen a tension that might be arising there? I only ask this reflecting on my own work with Syria recently, and we've seen a flip from the diaspora of like going from we want sanctions on the Assad regime to lift all sanctions right now. So have you seen a similar tension in Afghanistan? And if yes, what would be your take on this tension and navigating the same? Masuda is on a call right now and she will be right back. She did indicate this to us earlier, so I think she hasn't returned. Um, in the absence of Masuda and that question, I have yet another question for all of our speakers. So I am very prepared. Um, so we had a chance to hear about some of this from Ashley in her intervention towards the end. But for all of our speakers, and Ashley, feel free to come in again. We've heard a lot about the human cost of sanctions, the proliferation of sanctions, and George and Ashley offered a shadow of some hope in the longer term, the time period of sanctions so far and the trend with sanctions. But currently, people working in sanctions can often feel very hopeless. So, what would be, in your opinion, one thing that we could all lobby for, or encourage or fight for on the policy front to alleviate and ameliorate the situation with sanctions right now? Or what would be a move you would like to see from governing authorities, national governing authorities, or even from the special rapporteur on UCMs who will be incoming now? What would be something that you would like to see which might provide more hope to people living under sanctions, but also people working on sanctions?
I guess I'm happy to take a crack at that. Almost to the point of saying, yes, I'd encourage much more hope, but I'd like more results rather than just hope. And there are ways in which the hope as motivation creates opportunities to change some things that might create results. I think a sustained and cooperative strategy and plan among more and more civil society organizations and groups like your own C&SN and partnering with humanitarian groups right on the cusp of this, because I think we're in it for the longer term. The coincidence of, as Michael has mentioned, a cluster of other economic policies or masquerading as policies, their actions that have negative effects, already stifling the work we want to do for sanctions reform and increasing relief and lessening burden on people who are not responsible for the sanctions but are victims. All of that means I think we need a multi-year strategic planning dynamic. We crossed a major hurdle, I think. It went by very fast because Ashley was constrained by time for the renewal of essentially 2664. That was up for grabs until the end. And it does seem to me that despite the paralysis in the Security Council, there are ways in which the agenda of reform, even if, as some American colleagues I have painted as, well, that's because the Russians are so faced with sanctions themselves, they just want to do in the whole system. I'll take it right now that the Russians are cooperative on certain measures of sanctions relief, even if it's in their own narrow special interest. That's fine. Let's do it in many other places. And how do we mobilize that? but also because of the global financial humanitarian crisis sparked by the U.S. actions to pull back from so many of these organizations they've given support to over the years. And the notion that the EU is now facing an increasing guns or butter issue, increased amounts of military expenditures. Now, where's some of that going to come out of? It's going to come out of foreign aid of a different sort. So we need some strategic planning in ways to think about how we mobilize the few things of hope we have to more action and more results.
I can come in. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I'd say, I find hope in events like this, of course, all the people who are here, and particularly, as I mentioned, the fact of the International Day Against Unilateral Coercive Measures shows a continued recognition of the need to push on this. I mean, my hope is also, I sort of mentioned some of the geopolitical implications of Trump's furthering of the weaponization of, the US's place in the global economic architecture, but my hope is that there is also, due to such coordination that George mentioned, a greater recognition from sort of those who, Democrats, those who are opposed to Trump, that will come at their time in power, they see sort of the effects of what have happened, and that my hope is that there's not a return to the status quo ante, where, it was a bipartisan consensus to use unilateral coercive measures in this way, but perhaps recognizing the extent to which one person, Trump, was able to stretch these even further, there might be an ability to push back. And I know that there have been in Congress a number of efforts to rein in international emergency economic powers when it comes to tariffs, which I think is good, but few of those have included sanctions in that sort of the same sanctioning power. And I think that there are some congressional efforts underway to do such a thing. And this is really, I think, the right moment to do so, to recognize how abused these emergency powers have been, how abused these authorities have been, and then take action to rein them in. I think this is our moment.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in, and maybe I'll start with trying to answer David's question and then Rebecca, come to your question. So David, thanks so much for being here with us. I think there is an increase in targeting companies, at least in the Russian sanctions context. It seems like that's been happening a lot more, particularly this year. So just noting it's a good political moment to seize on this. The other option that there is with sanctions that is a more targeted measure and means is to think about global Magnitsky sanctions, which are generally imposed on someone who's committing grave violations of human rights. But the reason I'm bringing this one up is because it is a lot more targeted and what an actual smart sanction should be in practice. So it also keeps it more contained and avoids this collective punishment thing that we see. So I think that's an option that could be used there. And then in terms of things that we could lobby for or encourage, or different moves we'd like to see, I think others have mentioned this, but from the next UCMs mandate holder, a lot more engagement with civil society. We see this from other UN special rapporteurs on various thematic topics, that there's a lot of engagement with civil society, and we're able to really advocate collectively with them. So a lot more engagement there would be really great. I think if there could be engagement with governments, essentially acting as sanctioning authorities, with engaging civil society before sanctions are imposed. So we could think through together, have you built in sunset provisions? What are your off ramps? Are there accountability measures? Are you doing impact assessments? Having more engagement at initial stages versus it's imposed and now we're trying to mitigate the harms, I think would be a really, really valuable thing. Another thing, just this marriage of convenience we see between, at least in the US context, between government and banks, where each kind of blames the other for over-compliance and de-risking. So we need to move on from that, because it means neither has to take action if you're always blaming the other actor. So moving on from that so that we push each actor towards actual change. I mean, notably, to be fair to financial institutions, it is changes in government policy that would ultimately help to support some of the end to de-risking and over-compliance, but still this ending this blame shifting. And then just quickly, two more things. I think a deeper understanding of sanctions termination, so we don't have this period like we're seeing in Syria where nobody quite knows how to re-engage and reinvest or what to do. I think if we were to deepen all of our collective understanding of sanctions termination, we'd be able to respond better when we do see this wholesale lifting of sanctions as we've seen in Syria. And then just continuing to raise awareness here, I'm going to go more into designations, but just that the US is using counterterrorism designations, namely the Foreign Terrorist Organization one, way outside of the counterterrorism space, and it's proliferating into the counter-narcotics space, organized crime space, particularly Venezuela, Nicaragua, Haiti, Mexico. And this, creates opportunities for the US to then militarize the border, to do boots on the ground invasion, to all kinds of things. It also raises questions of who the U.S. will deem a terrorist, as we see in a lot of the executive actions coming out. So reminding folks that there are legal frameworks already in place and much better suited to deal with organized crime and with counter-narcotics, and not continuing to conflate counterterrorism measures, namely through FTO designations and these other frameworks.
Could I just add one thing to the great response to David's question? We had a moment as the Yugoslav sanctions came to an end where particularly trying to influence further, finally, the elimination as a leader of Milosevic, the Serbians were forced to open up certain economic sectors as placating the EU and the West. And in response to that, rather than sanctioning companies that stayed with Milosevic, what we did, or the Europeans and the Americans did, is they published a list of companies that were doing the very positive things that was hoped for, despite Milosevic being the leader. They were sort of the white companies instead of the terribly phrased the black companies, 1992, 93. And of course, immediately the repressive government went after all the white companies. But it raises the issue of how do you incentivize the companies and banks who are willing to take a risk, as you have a moment where you can get a lessening of sanctions, you can get a suspension and show in the suspension that broader opportunities for civil society and refurbishing the economy can happen. We have to be more creative of that and have to think about the flip side of a sanction. How do you drop a sanction and increase the incentives, both to the government that's been stubborn or those who are on the list who are non-compliant, but go around them through the efforts of civil society? How do you support organizations like Masuda's in ways that haven't been supported and not show that support from the outside is meant to undercut the government, but help to be part of a new aid package given to a government?
And I'll just
Sorry, before I can flag, after Masuda's response, David, I'm happy to come back to your second, and again, excellent question, but Masuda, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. One of the things we found is just you guys are experts and you're in your space, but like everyone else I talked to just has no idea how to address this. Like we called around because we had no idea, and nobody knows how to get these sanctions lifted. There's no process to get them lifted because it's not clear how you would get them lifted. Now, obviously, the Taliban should comply with international human rights law, and they should make sure that women and minorities have their human rights. I mean, I agree with that they should do these things. However, it wasn't even clear that doing so would get the sanctions lifted. So we as civil society can't even say if the Taliban improve their human rights record, to such and such base standards, then the sanctions would get lifted because we couldn't even get a clear answer that that would happen. And so it's not like the incentives structure is really there. I think kind of echoing what George was saying, it is like a bit of a black box. And what I would really wish, like the special rapporteur, for example, that exists, like Afghans don't even know this person exists. I'd never heard of this person until Charity and Security Network. So just kind of having people, a broader group of people understand, maybe through more events and engagement with civil society from these countries, that there is something that can be done about this. Because right now it just feels like a tool of war to the population, and as if they can't really do anything about it because they're obviously not going to be able to overthrow the Taliban either. And I want to add one more thing about the diaspora. There's been a lot of tension, and I think this is a very traditional thing from what I've learned, is that the diaspora that are in the U.S. and particularly, it seems like the lesser ties you have to the country, the more extreme measures you want to take to initiate change. When the collapse first happened, actually, it's very interesting. I think one of the reasons we got the really good general licenses from the Treasury Department. I understand that Afghanistan was like treated very kindly, despite what happened and the collapse and terrible conditions that I described, because Americans understood what was happening to Afghans on the ground because we had so many relationships with Afghans on the ground who had served in the US war, and they were saying, I'm hungry, I can't do this. The inflation, the depreciation of the currency, all this stuff is happening to me. And so there was more of a push from American civil society for something to happen, especially like veterans groups and such. In the absence of those ties, as they start to decrease, as distance, and time go on, we have lesser ties to the people, and there's less of a ability to kind of point out what the harmful effects of these sanctions. There is a lot of tension with the diaspora who is disconnected, but they don't live there. They're not feeling the effects of the sanctions. And so it's easy to say, yeah, they should change and let's just punish them until they do. But you have to go talk to the people in the country to understand what they're going through.
Thank you for that, Masood. That's yes, absolutely. That's a very powerful reflection. I do want to touch back upon something that George you mentioned in response to the answer to David's first question regarding the possibility of sanctioning companies and not governments. If I understand you correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, when we talk about the Milosevic example, we're talking about national companies and like maybe localized companies that then can be harmed. When you sanction these companies or you don't sanction certain companies, you're providing a white list and a black list to the government for who they should go after. And I concur to that point. But I think reflecting on the landscape today and the globalized nature and the rise of the multinational corporation, right? Um, how effective might you think this democratization of sanctions by the people to corporations might be? I mean, in the Israeli context, for example, I know BDS is not a new thing. It's been around since, South Africa at the very least. But in the Israeli context now, we see, banks who are more afraid to bank with settlements because they're afraid of the reputational risk. They're afraid of losing business from civilians who are very committed to the movement. And, the civilians have caused some damage to, Starbucks, for example, or McDonald's, and, these larger MNCs who definitely care about their bottom line of profit, right? And in this case, they're not necessarily nationalized, so the impact can be global. The sanctioning is kind of globally spread out, and it cannot be contained by one nation necessarily. So, in this case, do you think that a consumer-based push for almost this like democratic sanction by civil society can be useful? Is that where we go in the future to push back against, creatively push back against the broadening of sanctions by the right? Or is that again something that might have its own loopholes and pitfalls?
I think you only learn by trying. You have to act and see rather than judge and see, or judge and wait. I do think, though, just to take a note of what's happened in my own society and our own society in the United States of the last 6 months of spontaneous actions by citizen groups against companies like against Tesla, or positive actions like's happening now of people occupying Home Depot parking lots and saying, no, no ice here, thank you, and this and this. If that's an organized civil society response, you may be able to make some other kinds of headwinds. I think the lessons of things like the civil rights movements in different countries and the citizen solidarity movements have been that in conjunction with the actions of civil society, there ought to be a core leadership group that's in continued dialogue with the leadership that's imposed the stupid or the repressive policies, and be able to, in a sense, extract concessions for as long as the civil society action can, a consumer action can hold up.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you for that response. Moving on to our last question before we close out, again, one by David, a really thoughtful one once again. How can we shift the discourse from humanitarian exemptions in sanctions regimes to a humanitarian imperative in any sanctions regime, where burden of proof would be that governments ensure humanitarian assistance and civilian populations are fully protected, and that becomes a baseline for sanctioning? Hi, David. Nice to see you.
I don't want to overspeak here. Others should answer too, but this was the end of the Wilton Park process for us, and that is we put together a checklist that foreign service officers would use prior to imposing. In fact, at the design stage of sanctions, and we had 4 governments that were going to run it through their systems. And within the next 3 months after Wilton Park, 2 of those governments wound up with elections that elected a different person, one of them the United States, and a different party. So it wasn't implemented there. In a third country, the very fine foreign service officers who were enamored with this and in the sanctions office all got promoted to other offices within the economics division of their country. And it sort of has lied fallow. I'll be happy to send it to you so you see. But I think the idea is let's stop being reactionary at the most terrible moment of the impacts, but let's have a critical consciousness, ethical or practical or otherwise, that would say, let's not do that as a sanction because we know from other cases where 6 months down the road, it happens. We're just going to wind up being criticized. People that are innocent wind up being hurt. Can we tighten this? Can we design it a different way? Can we have a 6-month checkpoint? The monitoring that Michael and others have talked about, and Ashley as well. Where's the monitoring? And can we enlist a series of journalists who take on a task like this and say, look what's going on?
Yeah, I'm happy to also jump in. So David, the first part of my answer is going to sound like a cop-out, so stay with me, but I feel like I know you well enough that you'll stay with me. I think the easiest way would be a change in political will, but okay, yes, we all know that, right? So absent this, I do think, your question's a really thought-provoking one because it makes me think that maybe civil society and those of us working on the impacts of sanctions could also think about changing our own language rather than mirroring, the language of the UN, which they use humanitarian carve-outs, the US or more autonomous sanctioning entities use humanitarian exceptions or authorities or general licenses. So maybe if we did start shifting to this humanitarian imperative instead, that would at least create some modicum of a culture shift or internal thinking change from sanctioning entities. And I will say that in our advocacy around getting the 1267 regime under Resolution 2664 extended indefinitely, we did in the last few months do a relatively, it's maybe seemingly small, but significant language change because we realized that member states were not responding well to us saying we want this regime indefinitely extended. That made them uncomfortable, even though we all know most Security Council resolutions are indefinite and don't have this time-bound aspect of them like this one did. So we changed to saying standing application, and they were much more comfortable with that, member states were. And so the advocacy and the buy-in grew. So sometimes even seemingly small language changes can have really big outcomes and impacts. So appreciate the question to help push our thinking and how we could engage differently.
Thank you so much, Ashley and George, on your responses to that question. Masuda and Michael, any final thoughts on that? Or Ben, as Ashley noted, we saw you briefly come off mute. No pressure, but if you have a question, feel free to ask it. All right. Okay. No problem. Um, I just want to close out, since we're nearly at time, by thanking all of you here for being here with us today, especially our speakers, because you contributed such thoughtful. Sorry, I'm losing my words. I will note that it's 12 a.m. in Singapore, which is where I am, for contributing such thoughtful reflections to mark the inaugural day against unilateral coercive measures, and also specifically to David for your incredibly thought-provoking questions. Especially the first one really got me thinking, so thank you for that. What we've heard overall from our participants, from all of you as speakers, is a simple truth, which is that sanctions as they are operating today are not abstract foreign policy tools. They reshape daily life, they restrict essential services, and narrow the space for humanitarian action and civil society. As we move into the new year, C&SN will continue to work with many of you to document these impacts, push for rights-based reform, and support practical solutions that safeguard civilian well-being. Your partnership is indispensable to this effort, and so is your presence in this moment. And thank you so much for joining us for this incredibly important event. Thank you.
Thank you all for hosting it, and let's do this again next year.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Thank you.
And thanks
Thanks
to
so
all our
much.
panelists, because I know we a lot of times have much bigger attendance, but sometimes a smaller, more intimate can be nice as well. So appreciate everyone.
Thank you.
And also to note, David, George's response to you, to your question, if you do want the checklist, he will be willing to email it to you, and I'm happy to put you both in contact.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. Good to see everybody. Thanks so much. Excellent panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Purvika.
Thank you. Wait, I have a question. Are we
Wait.
staying on to wrap up, or do you want to switch to a Google Meet?
Let's stop recording.
Yes, indeed. Bye.